In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about some very specific types of grafting. So, the first type of grafting we're going to discuss is budding. This is one of the easiest types. This is a grafting technique where the scion is a small piece of bark, sometimes with a little bit of wood, containing a single bud. And there are two types of budding, chip budding and tea budding. Right, so chip budding is shown in the upper picture here, and then tea budding in the bottom right. A lot of the plants that are grafted commercially are grafted by budding. It's just very easy, very quick, and it has a high rate of success. So for example, a lot of fruit trees are budded, like peaches and things of that nature. So if you look at the top picture of chip budding, the top row of pictures there is the scion plant. So you go to the scion plant, you cut off a piece of it that contains a single bud, the bark, and a small piece of wood. So just a little chip containing a single bud. And then the bottom row of pictures there shows the rootstock plant. You cut a matching cut on the rootstock. At the bottom you're cutting in at about 45-degree angle, and then above that at maybe a 30-degree angle down to the bottom cut. So you make a little notch in the rootstock, you place the scion bud into that notch, and then you usually wrap that with what we call a budding band. It's just sort of a straight rubber band that you wrap around, tie off, and then cover it with a substance called parafilm, which is a sort of plastic waxy substance that we seal the bud in with to keep the humidity high in the area where the graft union is forming. So that's chip budding, and what happens then, eventually once the graft union forms, that bud will break and start to grow. At that point you will cut off everything on the rootstock above where that bud comes off, and then you'll train up that new shoot coming out of the bud you grafted as the main new trunk of that tree. Now on the picture on the bottom right, you can see tea budding. For tea budding, you remove the scion bud in a very similar way to how you remove the chip bud, but instead of cutting a notch in the rootstock, what you do is you cut a T-shaped cut as shown in that picture, and then you peel the two side flaps of the bark back, rest the scion bud beneath those flaps, and then cover it back up and seal it. Tea budding is one of those ones where you really need to have good bark slippage happening for it to be able to be done. It's really hard to peel the bark back from your cut like that if you don't have good bark slippage happening, because if there isn't good bark slippage, there isn't much of a separation between the bark and the vascular cambium, and you just can't peel it back to fit in that scion bud like you need to. So here's an example of a chip bud. You can see the scion bud has already been placed on the rootstock. You can see that light yellowy green outline of it. That's the vascular cambium. Now if you're doing budding and your scion bud is coming from a stem of smaller diameter than the diameter of the rootstock, what you need to do is line it up with the edge of the cut in the rootstock, because that's where the vascular cambium of the rootstock will be exposed, is at the edge. And so you're not going to center that scion bud in the notch, you're going to move it over to the side so it's more lined up with the vascular cambium of the rootstock. And then that clear plastic stuff that they're wrapping around it, that's parafilm. So this is a schematic drawing of chip budding versus tea budding. Chip budding is used a lot more often than tea budding now for a couple of reasons. The first one, remember again that with tea budding, it needs to be at a time of year when there's really good bark slippage, so you can peel back that bark more easily. That means you can only do tea budding during times of the year when the rootstock plant is actively growing, so you can only do it really in spring and early summer. Chip budding, on the other hand, you can do year-round. It doesn't matter because bark slippage is not so important because you're not having to peel the bark back at all. So chip budding is more commonly used because it can be done year-round, whereas tea budding can only be done when the rootstock is in active growth. And then this picture shows the other reason why. In both of these pictures, the dotted line represents the vascular cambium, the letters RS represent the rootstock, and CB means chip bud, TB means tea bud, so in both cases those are the scion. So if you look on the left, we have our chip bud, and you can see that the way you make the cuts for a chip bud and rest that notch in the rootstock, the vascular cambia of the rootstock with the chip bud from your scion plant lines up very closely with each other. On the other hand, if you look on the right picture of the T-bud, the way that the T-bud from the scion plant is placed beneath the layers of bark on the rootstock, those vascular cambia are not lined up quite as much, so that means more callus has to be produced to fill the gap between the two before that new vascular cambium can be formed. And that goes back again to why bark slippage needs to be high at the time of T-budding, because you need a lot of callus to bridge that gap here. So, in short, chip budding can be done any time of year, and it's a cut in which the vascular cambia of the rootstock and the scion are more closely lined up with each other. So it's just a better way to do it. There are many other types of grafts besides budding. So we have chip budding and T-budding, and then we have many other types of grafts. Usually people separate the term budding from the term grafting, because in budding you have a single bud on your scion. It's a very small piece. And all the other types of grafting, your scion piece is larger, and it's likely going to contain more than just one bud. So these graft types are named based on the type of cut you make to make the graft. So at the top left you can see something called a saddle graft. They actually have, you can make that cut with a knife, but you could see it would be quite difficult because of how curved it is and how narrow some of the pieces are. A lot of times saddle grafts are done using a grafting machine. You just put the stem in there, press down, and it makes the cut for you. This is done a lot of times for grapevines. In the middle is a very simple graft known as a cleft graft. You essentially just make a cut down the middle of your rootstock plant. You cut your scion so that the base of it is formed in somewhat of a wedge shape, and then you just wedge it down into that cut that you made in the rootstock and wrap it up. This is another graft that we do with horticulture students in their plant propagation class. And then finally, on the top right, you see both what's called a whip and tongue graft and also a side graft. Again, the difference is just about the types of cuts you make. For all types of grafting and budding, you need to make sure that you retain correct polarity for that scion piece. It needs to be oriented just as it was on the parent plant. You don't want to graft it in upside down, or the graft union will not successfully form. I want to talk about cactus grafting a little bit, because this is your extra credit propagation journal assignment. You can graft cacti for extra credit. Cacti have very wide compatibility. I think they may even flout the interfamilial incompatibility, but I'm not positive about that. Basically, any two cacti can be successfully grafted together. It takes a long time, so if you do this activity, the union won't fully form until probably after the semester is over, but it has a high rate of success. So in the picture here, what they have actually done is they cut off the top of the rootstock cactus, and then they did a cleft graft here, and they grafted 2 pieces of Christmas cactus in as their scions for that cleft graft. Then they took the top of the rootstock plant and stuck it as a cutting into that cat-shaped planter so that it's like the tail of a cat. Now, you don't have to use Christmas cacti. You could use a rootstock cactus, cut it off at the top, cut off the top of another cactus of similar diameter, put them on top of each other, bind them together, and it would work. Here's some more grafted cacti. You've probably seen many like this at home improvement stores. Something very interesting to note. If you look at the cacti that have the very bright pink and red and orange tops, like some of the ones in the pictures here, a lot of people think that's a flower. It's not. It's a grafted cactus, and this is what they do. Those brightly colored scion cacti are called moon cacti. So a moon cactus has been specially bred by man to not produce chlorophyll. And because it doesn't produce chlorophyll, that's how it turns that really bright color. Well, there's just one problem with that. Plants need chlorophyll to live. If they don't have chlorophyll, they can't photosynthesize. If they can't photosynthesize, they can't produce sugars and live. So a moon cactus cannot live on its own roots. What they do is they breed them, they grow them from seed, and then very early on, before they can die from the lack of sugars produced by photosynthesis, they are grafted onto a green chlorophyll-containing cactus. So without being grafted onto that green cactus, that moon cactus would quickly die. One other option you have for your extra credit propagation assignment, you can graft cacti or you can attempt to graft tomatoes or some other vegetable. Tomato grafting and the grafting of vegetables in general is really increasing in popularity in the United States. It's already used pretty widespread commercially in China and in some areas of Europe, and it's done with seedlings. It's done at a very early age. Now the main reason they do that is there's two major camps of tomato seed out there: hybrid tomato seed and heirloom tomato seed. Heirloom tomatoes are usually highly desired for their tomatoes. They have a much wider variety of tomato types available, and many people think they have much better flavor than the hybrid tomatoes. The problem is that the hybrid tomatoes, while they produce nice uniform fruit as well, a lot of people think they don't taste as good, but they do have superior disease resistance. Hybrid tomatoes have been specifically bred for disease resistance, since tomatoes get a lot of diseases. So, what if we could graft an heirloom tomato scion onto a hybrid tomato rootstock? Then we'd have a tomato with disease resistance and delicious heirloom tomatoes. So that's why this is popular. The graft that's shown here is called an approach graft. So they make a slit in each seedling, they bind them together. What they'll do once the graft union is formed is they'll cut off the bottom of the scion plant and the top of the rootstock plant, so that what remains is a plant with the bottom of the rootstock plant and the top of the scion plant. An approach graft is a nice graft to do because the scion plant is continuing to receive water and nutrients from its own roots during the graft union formation. And other types of grafting, you've cut it off from the roots of the parent plant of the scion, and so it's not getting water and you're needing the graft union to form really quickly before that scion dries out. This doesn't just work with tomatoes, you can also use it with peppers, eggplants, melons, and cucumbers. And now, let me really blow your mind. Things in the family Solanaceae, such as tomatoes and eggplants, are both in that family. Intergeneric compatibility exists. So you can actually graft tomatoes onto other things in that family, such as you can graft a tomato plant onto a potato plant and get a plant that produces both tomatoes and potatoes. What? I'll have a link on the website for you about that. Even better, you can graft a tomato plant scion onto a tobacco rootstock and end up with tomatoes that contain nicotine. Now they actually contain so much nicotine that it would kill you much more quickly than cigarettes if you ate it. But your friendly TA Hayden has a plan to fix that whole situation and make sun-dried, tomatoed, non-harmful chewing tobacco using the grafting of the tomatoes and the tobacco. So if you meet with him again, ask him to explain his theory to you. It's great. So a few closing tips for you before we end. First, if you are grafting something, make sure you use a very sharp knife. It's really important to make sharp, clean cuts when grafting so you don't damage the vascular cambia. Because you're using a very sharp knife, be careful. A good general rule when you're practicing grafting is to never have a hand in front of where the knife is going. It should always be above the knife. Do your research, find out what plants are compatible, what is the best type of graft to use, what is the best time of year to try that graft, and then just practice, because practice makes perfect. So with that, we are ending our mini lectures on grafting. I hope you've enjoyed them.